In this video, we're going to take a look at the Abbey Road Orchestra library, Percussion. We'll see each control, what it is, and how it works. Starting in the top left corner of the plugin, we have the LED light. The LED light is an indication of whether our samples are still loading. Wait for this to be solid green before you hit play or to try and trigger any samples. Next to this, we've got the CPU meter, which is an indication of how hard the processor on your machine is working. We then have the disk meter, which is an indication of how hard the samples drive you're streaming the samples data from is working. If these two are flickering red, there's a good chance we need to optimize something on your system, so please do get in touch with us if that's the case. We then have the memory option, which is an indication of how much sample content is loaded into the RAM of your machine. We then have the voices meter, which will tell you how many audio threads you're streaming at any particular one point in time. To the right of this, we have the refresh icon, which is really useful if you have anything like sticking MIDI notes. This can be right-clicked if you wish to update all the instruments to the latest version. That might be useful if you have a really old session and you want to take those presets and update them to the latest version after you've installed the update. We then have the option to refresh the samples, so reload them. We then have the ability to refresh just this plugin instance, or the ability to refresh all instances of Abbey Road Orchestra in that session. To the right of this, we've then got the MIDI channel, which is where we can make this particular plugin respond to any 1 to 16 MIDI channels. To the right of this, we have a global tuning option and a global panning option, and also a master volume for the plugin. To the right of this, we have the two settings options. The first one is the preset settings. Now, the preset settings are settings that determine the behavior of the patch that you have loaded. So starting at the very top, we have the dynamics control. The dynamics control is this fader in the middle of the plugin that you can see moving there. So this option allows us to change the behavior of that control. By default, this is always set to full velocity range, which means for long articulations, we can start at a very quiet dynamic and go all the way up to a very loud dynamic. If we want to change that, we have 4 different options. The velocity map to dynamics options allows you to change short articulations to respond to the dynamics fader. By default, short articulations, such as, general hits of a drum, will respond to how hard or soft you hit the key. This overrides that and makes them respond to the dynamics fader. We then have 2 compressed velocity options. What these do is you can think of turning this dynamics control into what is a MIDI limiter. So it will compress the range of your velocities when you're hitting the keys hard and soft. We then have the velocity option, which enables us to change the response of the plugin to match your MIDI controller. So if you have a MIDI controller where it's very easy to trigger the really loud velocities, you might want to set this to exponential negative, which is where the velocities you can hit harder and trigger a softer response. We then have a few different options, such as exponential positive, which is the opposite, linear velocity, which is the default, and also a shelf velocity. Under the CC mappings option, you can reset all the parameters to their default CC controls, or you can just get rid of all the assignments. The sync to tempo function isn't used in this library. We then have the voice choking control. Now, voice choking, when enabled, gives you the ability to place a single hit to interrupt the rolls at any point. The roll end is slightly different, so if you are holding a roll down, and you then lift your key off, when that no off message is sent, a pre-recorded natural hit is placed at the end of the roll for a more definite finish. The soft takeover option gives the long articulations, so the rolls, the ability to be velocity sensitive at the same time as also using the dynamics fader. The dynamics fader, so the modulation wheel, will only become active once you've moved it past the level of velocity that you've triggered the keys at, which means if you trigger at a very medium to low velocity, you then have an extra 2/3 of dynamic range you can increase by using the dynamics fader. We then have the short releases option, which gives you the ability to alter the ending of the sample or when that sample ends. By default, this is set to none, which means the sample will always play its full duration, i.e. a one shot. If you then change this to be timed, that will allow you to release the note slightly earlier than the duration of the sample. And then we have the untimed option, which will allow you to trigger releases at the end of the sample if you let go of that key. A new feature introduced in the high percussion library is also the solo latch option, which is an improvement on the solo mute functionality that we see on the mixing window. I'll return to this later on in the video. To the right of the preset settings, we then have the overall plugin settings, which is where we can see a whole host of global options to change across the whole plugin. So this will be things such as the size in which it opens, whether the key switches are displayed on the keyboard at the bottom or not, whether the gain units of the master volume is in decibels or a percentage. The audio options give you the ability to change things such as how much sample content is loaded into the RAM of your machine, the overall tuning of the library, whether this is a A440 or A432. And also under plugin, we can change the default preset. In my case, as you can see here, I've got the library to open up as none by default because it's a better use of the memory and it means that the plugin will also open quicker. If you want to learn more about these settings, please do read the manual because they're covered in much more detail. Below the settings option, we have the collapse and expand view. So this is the collapsed view, and then we also have the ability to expand it to see the bottom half of the interface. Moving to the left, we then have the preset drop-down menu, which can be opened by clicking in the bar at the top. On the left-hand side of the preset drop-down, you can see a whole host of filters. I currently have two libraries from the Abbey Road Orchestra range installed, so I'm going to filter by high percussion so I can see all the high percussion options. Here on the right-hand side, I can favorite a sound, which would then show up in the starred filter at the top. I can then preview the sound. And if I want to learn more about that particular sound, I can also hover over the information icon to the right. To load a sound, you can double click, or you can click the preset and then click load. To the right of the preset menu, we have two little arrows which will cycle up and down through the presets within the filter. So if you have the high percussion filter enabled, the arrows will only cycle through the high percussion presets. We then have the save option, which is where we can save our own custom preset once we've made changes to it. So if you set any custom CC ranges, you would want to create a user preset for that. The user presets show up in the user filter at the bottom. Moving down the interface, we have three main controls. We have the expression control. So this is an overall volume control which operates within the master volume. We then have the dynamics fader in the middle, which we've already covered in quite some detail. Moving to the right, we then have the knob control, which by default is reverb. But if you click the middle of it, so you can see there it changes colour, there's a couple of different options. And these options can change depending on the preset or the articulation that you have selected. Moving down the interface once more, we then have the technique switcher. So the technique switcher is where we can change and see all our articulation options. So here for this preset, we can see there are three different articulations. To the right of this is the technique editor, which is where we can choose to remove articulations or move them around if we prefer a different order. We then have on the left all the same information that we have in the preset menu, such as information, a preview, and a filtering system. To the right of the technique editor, we then have the trigger option. Now, the trigger option is the method in which you wish to change articulations. So for example here, I have the hands set to key switch, but if I change this to CC range, we can see here now I have the ability to change which CC this responds to, i.e. in this case CC32, and I can change the range of this to be 1. However, if I now go to the brushes, we can see that that is still set to key switch. So if I wanted all the articulations to respond to a particular trigger method, I would need to change them all to CC range. We then have the ability to do this via velocity range, so how hard or soft you hit the keys, the MIDI channel. If you want to do MIDI channel switching, make sure that the plugin is set to receive all MIDI channels, because you need each articulation to respond to a different MIDI channel. We then have the speed, so how fast you play, and you also have the program change option. The activate option is going to give you the ability to choose between a normal and a latched state of key switching. Normal means that when you trigger a different key switch, it will just change straight to the next one and stay at that until you next call upon a trigger method. If it's latched and you key switch to the next articulation, that articulation will momentarily be switched and then it will revert back to the previous articulation. The round robin options, as you can see there's 12, allow you to limit how many round robins you can have for that particular articulation. So if you limit this to 1, you would have a very machine gun effect with just hearing the same sample go round and round. By having this set to 12, it means we can cycle through 12 different samples each time we hit the key. The reset on transport option allows the cycle of the round robins to reset every time you hit play in your DAW. The reset from key enables us to place key switches on the keyboard at the bottom of the plugin in order to trigger particular round robins that we like. So if I was to place the key switches right at the very top end of the keyboard from A5 upwards, I can see that I've got these green keys for the round robins, and there are 12 green keys, 1 per round robin. So if I perhaps didn't like the 4th in the cycle, I could press a key switch to change to the 5th. The round robin options aren't available in this library. You then have the transpose option, which enables you to transpose where the samples are. The two-handed layout is what we have visible at the bottom, which is where we duplicate the samples 2 octaves higher in order for you to perform the keyboard two-handed. If this is turned off, we will see that we only have the left hand. The right-left mapping option enables the user to place a mapping layout on the keyboard where the left samples, so the left drumstick hits, are different to the right drumstick hits. So as we can see when I enable this, the colours on the keyboard change slightly at the bottom. This can help bring just that little bit more realism to the performances that you're creating. In the very top right hand corner we then have a key switch shimmier, which is where if we transpose the keyboard at the bottom down by using these 2 arrows in the bottom left hand corner, if we click and drag, we can change the range of the default key switches. We then have a padlock to lock all this in place. In the middle of the plugin, we've got the view selector options, which is where we can change between the different pages. The middle option is for the signal mixer, and starting in the top left-hand corner, we have the ability to save a custom microphone preset, which is really cool because it means that if you create a custom preset, which is where it's a little bit more ambient, let's say, you can then save it and reload it in a different plugin. We then have the ability to the right to recall that preset. We then have the ability to refresh the signal mixer back to its default. So if I create, let's say, a custom mix, and then I can then refresh that back to its default state. The advanced option enables us to change to a more simple view of the mixer, which is where we can basically change between a close sound and a distant sound. The global option, when disabled, allows us to change the signal mixer depending on the articulation that we have selected. So for example, we can see on the articulation page that I've got hands selected, but on the brushes maybe I want a slightly more closer sound because it's softer. What I might choose to do is I might choose to just bring in a little bit more close signal on the brushes. So now if I change back to the hands, we can see that it's only mix 1 enabled. But if I change back again to the brushes, we can see I've got close and mix 1 enabled. As we can see, we've got a fader to change the overall volume of the level. If we turn this all the way down, by default, that will unload the signal. If we're not using a signal, it's always important to make sure that these particular toggles are always turned off. Otherwise, we'll be still triggering that sample content. It's just a volume thing that's turned it all the way down. If you left them turned on, that can increase your disk usage, your CPU usage, due to having higher voice counts. Below these little toggles, we then have the solo and mute functionality, which is where we can solo a particular signal, such as here I've soloed the close, or if I have a couple of different signals loaded, such as the 2 different close mics, and I want to audition them, I can swap between them. The behavior of these solo buttons can be determined from the settings in the preset menu. So as you can see here, I have the solo latch option on, which means I can stack, say, the 2 close microphones together and solo the 2 together. If that is disabled, it will cancel the previous solo, which means we can audition between the 2 signals quickly. We then have a range of shortcuts which we can use. So if you don't want to use the solo latch feature, we could hold shift down on the keyboard and click the 2 solo options. This also works for the mutes. If we click Alt while 2 are soloed, we disable all solos. If a signal is soloed at the bottom, and I decide that I no longer want this signal and it's still soloed, and I turn it down, you'll also note that that now turns off the solo functionality. We then have 2 arrows at the bottom below the solo mutes, which is where we can see a further range of microphone options. To the right of this, we have a stereo width and panning control, which is only going to affect the close signals or the spot signals. This is the same for the panning control, which allows us to change the close and spot signals left or right in the stereo image. And we also have a left and right invert. This is the sort of thing that's quite useful if you're using the library for more of a popular music kind of track and you want more control over the stereo field for close microphones. Once more, we then have a lock in the top right corner to make sure that none of these signals get accidentally changed. Then finally, we have the FX page, which is where we can again increase the reverb and the tightness. The tightness control, when increased, will cut into the start of the sample, which means you have a snappier response. The issue with increasing this all the way is you will cut off the initial attack of the beta, which means you lose a little bit of that natural performance. So the way to work with this control is often have it quite high if you're performing to, say, a click track, so you have the faster, snappier responses. And then once you've got that recorded and quantized, you can back off the tightness to allow that beta sound to come through and have a little bit more of a natural response. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at spitfireaudio.com/support.
Thanks for watching Spitfire Clips. Let us know if it was too long, too short, too fast, or too slow in the comments down below. Hit like if we answered your question, and subscribe for more clips, tips, tricks, and exclusive Spitfire content.